They said he was a monster. For 9 years, Philip Wallace wore that label: child killer, wife murderer, the man who burned his own family alive. Hours before the state of Wisconsin would end his life by lethal injection, he asked for only one thing: not mercy from men, not a final chance to plead his case. He asked to kneel before a statue of the Virgin Mary. "If I die innocent," he whispered that night, "let them see it." What happened next would stop an execution, expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of law enforcement, and prove that miracles still happen, even in rooms built for death. This is the story of Philip Wallace, and it will break your heart and restore your faith at the same time. Before we dive in, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. Now let's begin. This is Philip Wallace's story. But to understand what happened in that chapel on the night of October 29, 2014, to comprehend the miracle that unfolded before witnesses who would never be the same, we need to go back 9 years. Back to the night a hero became a monster. Back to when everything Philip loved turned to ash. November 14, 2005. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Philip Wallace was 36 years old, and until that cold November night, he was not a man anyone would call a monster. He was a decorated firefighter with Milwaukee Fire Department's Engine Company 19, a 12-year veteran known for his calm under pressure and his willingness to go into places others feared. His locker at the station was covered with photos: Grace blowing out candles at her 5th birthday party, Emma laughing on their anniversary, the three of them at the Wisconsin State Fair eating corn dogs and cotton candy. Family man through and through, Captain Jerry Holcomb would later tell reporters, his voice thick with disbelief. Phil was the guy you wanted on your crew. Steady. Brave. The kind of father I hoped my own kids would grow up to be. Emma Wallace taught 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary School. Her classroom walls were covered with student artwork, each piece carefully labeled with a child's name and the date. She had a gift for reaching the kids others had given up on, the ones who couldn't sit still, who acted out, who came to school hungry or bruised or both. She saw something in them that reminded her of why she'd become a teacher in the first place. Their daughter Grace was 6 years old, gap-toothed and fearless, with her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn determination. She wanted to be a firefighter just like Daddy, and she made everyone call her Grace the Brave. Every Halloween, she wore the child-sized fire helmet Philip had bought her, refusing to take it off even for bed. On paper, they were living the American dream. But beneath the surface, something dark was gathering. 3 months before the fire, Philip had filed a formal safety complaint with the Wisconsin Department of Commerce. A massive commercial construction project, the Brennan Tower, a luxury high-rise development, had been cutting corners. Dangerous corners. Philip had responded to a small electrical fire at the site and noticed violations that made his blood run cold. Faulty wiring, blocked emergency exits, missing fire suppression systems. He'd reported it. Filed the paperwork. Testified at the hearing. The project was shut down for 6 weeks. The developer, Marcus Brennan, lost millions in delays, penalties, and mandatory upgrades. Brennan was a man with deep pockets, deeper connections, and a reputation for making problems disappear. Philip didn't know it yet, but speaking truth to power had painted a target on his family. Emma noticed the change first. Her husband grew distant, distracted. He'd stand at their daughter's bedroom door at night, just watching Grace sleep, as if memorizing her face. Strange phone calls started coming to the house. Hang-ups when Emma answered, low voices when Philip picked up. "What's going on?" Emma asked him one night after Grace was in bed. Philip looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, fear and fury mixed together. "Nothing I can't handle," he said. He was wrong. November 14th started like any other Tuesday. Philip worked a 24-hour shift, coming home Wednesday morning exhausted and smelling like smoke from a 3-alarm warehouse fire. Emma made him breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Grace climbed into his lap and told him about the guinea pig in her classroom named Pickles. "Pickles is my best friend," Grace announced seriously. "Even better than Madison, and Madison shares her fruit snacks." Philip kissed the top of her head, breathing in the strawberry scent of her shampoo. "That's pretty serious," he said. "I know," Grace replied. It was the last normal conversation they would ever have. That evening, Emma put Grace to bed at 8 o'clock, the usual bedtime, the usual routine. Pajamas with stars on them. 3 stories from the worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. A glass of water on the nightstand. A kiss on the forehead. "Love you to the moon," Emma whispered. "And back again," Grace mumbled, already half asleep. Philip was in the garage, working on a bookshelf he'd been building for Grace's room. Emma brought him a beer and watched him measure and cut, his movements precise and practiced. "You're a good father," she said quietly. Philip looked up, surprised. "Where's that coming from?" "I just wanted you to know." She kissed him and went inside to grade papers at the kitchen table. That was at 9:47 p.m. At 10:23 p.m., Emma Wallace dialed 911. The recording would later become Exhibit A in Philip's defense, though it would take 9 years and a miracle to bring it to light. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's in my house. Emma's voice was tight with fear. I heard glass breaking. My daughter's upstairs. Ma'am, are you safe? Can you get out? He's wearing a mask. Oh God, he has something in his hand. The line went dead. At 10:31 p.m., the house at 1847 Maple Ridge Drive exploded in flames. Philip Wallace woke up on his front lawn with no memory of how he got there. His lungs burned. His head pounded. When he tried to sit up, a firefighter, one of his own brothers from Engine 19, pushed him gently back down. Easy, Phil. Easy. Emma, Philip croaked. Grace. They're inside. The look on the firefighter's face told Philip everything he needed to know. He tried to run back into the inferno. It took 3 men to hold him down. He was still screaming their names when the paramedics sedated him. Emma and Grace Wallace died in that fire. The medical examiner would later determine that Emma had died from smoke inhalation before the flames reached her. Grace's small body was found in her bedroom, clutched in her mother's arms. Emma had made it upstairs. She had reached their daughter. But she couldn't get them out. The arson investigation began immediately. Fire Marshal Thomas Kelly walked through the charred remains of the Wallace home with Detective Harlan Pierce from the Milwaukee Police Department. What they found, or claimed to find, would seal Philip Wallace's fate. Accelerant traces. Gasoline, poured in a deliberate pattern through the first floor. The point of origin, the garage where Philip had been working. Philip's clothes tested positive for accelerant residue. His fingerprints were on the empty gas can found in the debris. And then came the testimony that would damn him forever. Officer Daniel Briggs, a patrol cop who arrived on scene, claimed that Philip had confessed while being treated by paramedics. He said, I did it. God forgive me, I did it, Briggs testified. There was no recording. No witness to corroborate. Just Briggs's word against a man who insisted he remembered nothing after putting down his beer and walking toward the house because he thought he heard Emma scream. The prosecution's theory was simple and devastating. Philip Wallace, under financial pressure and marital strain, had snapped. He'd killed his family for the insurance money. The accelerant on his clothes, the gas can with his prints, the confession. It all pointed to premeditated murder. Philip's overworked public defender mounted almost no defense. No expert witnesses to challenge the accelerant analysis. No investigation into Philip's claims of threats following his testimony against Brennan. No explanation for why a decorated firefighter with no history of violence would suddenly murder the family he adored. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom was packed the day Judge Margaret Hartwell delivered Philip's sentence. Emma's sister sobbed in the gallery. Grace's teacher from Riverside Elementary held a framed photo of the little girl in the fire helmet. Captain Holcomb sat stone-faced in the back row, unable to reconcile the man he knew with the monster the state described. Philip stood as the judge spoke, his hands cuffed, his orange jumpsuit too big for his frame. He'd lost 20 pounds since the arrest. His eyes were hollow, ringed with sleepless nights. Mr. Wallace, Judge Hartwell began, her voice cold and final, you have been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, your wife Emma and your daughter Grace. The evidence presented was overwhelming. The cruelty of your actions beyond comprehension. Philip's lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Philip barely felt it. You were trusted to protect the innocent. Instead, you became their destroyer. This court sees no mitigating factors, no reason for mercy. The gallery held its breath. I hereby sentence you to death by lethal injection. Someone in the back gasped. Emma's sister let out a wail that echoed through the chamber. Philip Wallace didn't react. He simply closed his eyes and whispered something no one else could hear. I didn't do it. They sent him to Waupun Correctional Institution, home to Wisconsin's death row. Cell block H, 8 feet by 10 feet. Concrete walls painted institutional green. A narrow bed. A metal toilet. A small desk bolted to the floor. Through the narrow window, nothing but razor wire and guard towers. For the first 2 years, Philip raged. He filed appeal after appeal, each one denied. He wrote letters to journalists, advocacy groups, anyone who might listen. But the evidence against him seemed insurmountable. No one wanted to defend a man who burned his own child alive. His mother, Carol Wallace, visited every month without fail, 3 buses and a 2-mile walk to reach the prison. She never believed her son was guilty. Never wavered. Never stopped praying. "Your father would be proud of how you're holding up," she'd tell him through the glass partition, though they both knew it was a lie. Philip wasn't holding up. He was drowning. By year 3, something in Philip broke. He stopped filing appeals. Stopped writing letters. Stopped hoping. The rage turned inward, became something darker. Despair. The kind that eats you from the inside out. He stopped attending chapel services. Stopped reading the Bible his mother brought him. Stopped praying the prayers she taught him as a boy. If God was real, he told Father Gabriel Mackenzie, the prison chaplain, Emma and Grace would still be alive. Father Gabriel, a 62-year-old former Marine with kind eyes and a Boston accent, didn't argue. He just kept showing up. Kept offering to sit with Philip. Kept leaving small gifts, a book, a magazine, a candy bar from the commissary. "I'm not here to convert you," Father Gabriel said during one visit. "I'm just here." It was in year 5 that something shifted. A prison librarian, Mrs. Eleanor Chin, slipped Philip an old Bible during a book cart rotation. Inside, tucked between the pages of the Gospel of Matthew, was a worn prayer card. The image showed the Virgin Mary in a blue mantle, her hands open, her expression both sorrowful and full of love. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "The truth will shine where lies cannot." Philip stared at that card for hours. He didn't know who'd left it there. Didn't know if it was meant for him or if Mrs. Chen had simply grabbed a random Bible off the shelf. But that night, for the first time in 3 years, Philip Wallace knelt beside his concrete bed and prayed. He didn't have fancy words. Didn't remember all the prayers his mother had taught him. He just whispered into the darkness, "If you're real, if you're listening, help me." That's when the dream started. The first one came 2 nights after he found the prayer card. Philip stood in a field of white flowers, thousands of them, stretching to the horizon. The sky above was impossibly blue, the kind of blue that only exists in childhood memories. And there, standing in the middle of the field, was Grace. She wore her star pajamas and her fire helmet. She was smiling. "Daddy," she said, her voice clear as bells. Philip tried to run to her, but his legs wouldn't move. "Grace, baby, I'm so sorry." "It's okay, Daddy." Grace tilted her head, and behind her, Philip saw a woman in blue. Tall. Radiant. Her face partially hidden by a veil, but her eyes held the universe. "She says you have to keep praying," Grace said. "The truth is coming." Philip woke up sobbing. He told no one about the dream. But the next night it came again. And the night after that. Always the same field. Always Grace and the woman in blue. Always the same message, keep praying. The truth is coming. Father Gabriel noticed the change. Philip started attending chapel again. Started reading scripture. Started praying the rosary his mother had sent him, the beads moving through his fingers like a lifeline. "Something's different about you," Father Gabriel said one day. "I don't know if I believe yet," Philip admitted. "But I'm trying." "That's all faith is," the chaplain replied. Trying. In August 2014, Philip's final appeal was denied by the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The execution date was set, October 30, 2014, at 12:01 a.m. Philip had 3 months to live. The media coverage was brutal. Victims' rights groups rallied outside the prison, holding signs with Emma and Grace's pictures. "Justice for the innocent," the signs read. "Burn in hell, Wallace." Philip's mother collapsed during one of her visits. The stress, the heartbreak, it was killing her too. "I'm ready, Mom," Philip told her through the glass. "I'm not afraid anymore." Carol Wallace pressed her palm against the partition, and Philip matched it with his own. "I know you didn't do it," she whispered. "I've always known." "I know you do. God knows too, baby. God knows." As the days counted down, Philip found himself thinking about that prayer card more and more. The truth will shine where lies cannot. He carried it with him everywhere, tucked into his shirt pocket, close to his heart. Father Gabriel visited daily now. They prayed together. Talked about heaven. About forgiveness. About the mysteries no man could answer. What happens after? Philip asked 1 week before his execution. "I don't know," Father Gabriel admitted. "But I believe we're met with love. Perfect love. The kind that explains everything and asks nothing." Philip nodded slowly. I hope Grace is there. She is, Father Gabriel said with absolute certainty. And she's waiting for her daddy. On October 29, 2014, the day before his execution, Warden James Callahan came to Philip's cell. Time to make your final arrangements, the warden said, not unkindly. He'd been doing this job for 23 years and he never got used to this part. What would you like for your last meal? Philip looked up from the prayer card he'd been holding. I don't want a meal. Phone call? Someone you want to speak to? No. Statement you want released? Philip shook his head. Warden Callahan frowned. Son, this is your last chance to. I want to see the Virgin Mary. The warden blinked. Excuse me? There's a statue in the chapel, Philip said, his voice steady. I want to kneel before her. That's all I'm asking. Warden Callahan studied Philip for a long moment. The request was unusual but not unheard of. Some men wanted a priest. Some wanted a rabbi. A few wanted nothing at all. I'll see what I can do. At 11 p.m., 4 corrections officers came to Philip's cell. Officer Daniel Briggs was among them. The 4 officers stood outside Philip Wallace's cell, their keys jangling in the fluorescent-lit corridor of cell block H. It was 11 p.m., and the prison had fallen into that particular kind of silence that only exists in places where hope goes to die. Officer Daniel Briggs hung back slightly from the others, his hand resting on his belt, his eyes fixed on the concrete floor. He was 41 years old now, graying at the temples, 20 pounds heavier than he'd been 9 years ago. The weight wasn't from good living, it was from sleepless nights, from bottles emptied alone, from a conscience that wouldn't stay quiet no matter how hard he tried to drown it. Wallace, Warden Callahan said through the cell bars. It's time. Philip stood slowly, setting the prayer card carefully on his narrow bed. He held out his wrist for the cuffs without being asked. He'd learned the routine over 9 years. Compliance made everything easier, not better, just easier. The cell door rolled open with a metallic groan. Officer Ryan Holt, the youngest of the 4 guards, couldn't help but notice how calm Philip seemed. Most men about to die showed it somehow, shaking hands, shallow breathing, eyes darting around looking for an escape that didn't exist. But Philip Wallace looked almost peaceful, like a man who'd already made peace with what was coming. This way, Warden Callahan said quietly. They walked through the cell block in silence, past rows of identical green doors, each one containing a man waiting to die. Some prisoners called out, wishes of luck, prayers, curses. Philip acknowledged none of them. His eyes were fixed straight ahead on the path that would lead him to the chapel, to the Virgin Mary, to whatever came next. As they approached the chapel entrance, Officer Marcus Webb, a 15-year veteran who'd escorted more condemned men than he cared to count, glanced at Briggs. You good? Webb whispered. Briggs nodded, but his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the chapel door. He wasn't good. He hadn't been good in 9 years. The chapel was small, barely larger than 3 cells put together. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A simple wooden cross mounted on the far wall. And in the corner, illuminated by a single overhead light, stood the statue. The Virgin Mary, carved from white marble, her robes painted sky blue, her hands open in eternal welcome. Her face was gentle, impossibly serene, with eyes that seemed to see everything and judge nothing. Philip stopped in the doorway, his breath catching. Give us a moment, Father Gabriel said softly, stepping forward from where he'd been waiting. The elderly chaplain looked at the officers with quiet authority. Let the man pray. Warden Callahan hesitated, then nodded. 10 minutes. We'll be right outside. No, Philip said suddenly, his voice hoarse. Let them stay. Everyone turned to look at him. Whatever happens, Philip continued, his eyes still fixed on the statue, I want witnesses. The warden and Father Gabriel exchanged glances. There was something in Philip's tone, not desperation, not fear, but certainty. Like he knew something they didn't. All right, Warden Callahan said slowly. Officers remain inside. Stay by the walls. The 4 guards positioned themselves around the perimeter of the chapel. Briggs chose a spot as far from Philip as possible, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his eyes anywhere but on the condemned man. Philip walked forward slowly, his chains clinking with each step against the tile floor. When he reached the statue, he lowered himself carefully to his knees, his cuffed hands clasped in front of him. For a long moment he simply knelt there, breathing. Then he whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear. If I die innocent, let them see it. The candles Father Gabriel had lit flickered once. The air in the chapel seemed to shift, like the pressure had dropped suddenly, the way it does before a storm. Officer Holt felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. And then Philip Wallace closed his eyes and began to pray. But to understand what was about to happen in that chapel, to comprehend the weight of those whispered words and the miracle that would unfold before men who thought they'd seen everything, we need to go back. Back to when Philip Wallace was still a hero. Back to when the only fires he fought were the ones he ran toward, not the ones that consumed his life. January 2005. Milwaukee, Wisconsin. On a bitter Tuesday morning in January with temperatures hovering at 12 degrees and the wind cutting through Milwaukee like a knife, Philip Wallace ran into hell. The call came at 5:47 a.m., chemical fire at Midwest Industrial Supply, a warehouse on the south side that stored everything from paint thinner to industrial solvents. By the time Engine 19 arrived, black smoke was pouring from every window, and the building was making the kind of groaning sounds that meant it wouldn't be standing much longer. "We've got workers trapped inside," Captain Jerry Holcomb shouted over the roar of the flames. "Third floor, northwest corner. Wallace, Kowalski, you're up." Philip didn't hesitate. He checked his breathing apparatus, adjusted his helmet, and followed his partner Mike Kowalski into the inferno. The heat inside was immense, the kind that makes your skin feel like it's shrinking even through the protective gear. Visibility was near zero. They followed the hose line like a lifeline, calling out, listening for voices beneath the roar of the fire. "Here," Kowalski shouted. "I've got two." Two warehouse workers, overcome by smoke, lay unconscious near a collapsed shelving unit. Philip and Kowalski grabbed them, one under each arm, and started dragging them toward the exit. The floor beneath them was buckling. Chemical drums were exploding in the heat, sending jets of flame shooting across the warehouse. They were 20 feet from the exit when Philip heard it, a voice, weak and desperate, calling for help from somewhere deeper in the building. "There's another one," Philip said into his radio. "Negative," Captain Holcomb's voice crackled back. "Building's coming down. Get out now." Philip looked at the exit. At safety. At the two men they'd already saved. Then he looked back into the smoke. "I'm going," he said. "Wallace, that's an order." But Philip was already running back into the flames. He found the third worker, a kid, couldn't have been more than 20, pinned beneath a fallen beam. The kid's eyes were wide with terror and pain. "I got you," Philip said, his voice muffled by the mask. "I got you, son." He leveraged the beam up with a piece of broken metal scaffolding, just enough for the kid to crawl free. Then Philip half carried, half dragged him through the maze of fire and smoke, following his instincts and his training, praying with every step that the floor wouldn't give out beneath them. They made it out 18 seconds before the roof collapsed. The local news ran the story for 3 days. Firefighter defies orders to save trapped worker. Philip gave one interview, standing in his dress uniform, looking uncomfortable with all the attention. "I just did my job," he said when the reporter asked if he considered himself a hero. But Emma Wallace, watching from home with 6-year-old Grace on her lap, knew better. She knew the man she'd married, the man who ran toward danger when others ran away, who couldn't leave anyone behind, who'd risk everything for a stranger. She was proud of him. She was also terrified. The nightmare started 2 weeks after the warehouse fire. Philip would wake up gasping, his t-shirt soaked with sweat, the smell of smoke still in his nostrils even though it wasn't real. He'd see the flames. Hear the screams. Feel the floor giving way beneath his feet. "You should talk to someone," Emma said gently one morning after a particularly bad night. "The department has counselors." "I'm fine," Philip said, pouring his third cup of coffee. "Just need some sleep." But he wasn't fine. The trauma from the warehouse, combined with years of calls of bodies pulled from car wrecks and children burned in house fires, was taking its toll. Philip started volunteering for extra shifts, anything to avoid being alone with his thoughts. The overtime helped with the bills, but it meant less time at home. Less time with Emma and Grace. Emma tried to be understanding. She knew the job was hard. Knew what Philip saw on those calls. But she also knew that her daughter was asking why Daddy was never home anymore, and she didn't know what to tell her. "You're working yourself to death," Emma said one evening in March after Philip came home at midnight from his 4th double shift in 2 weeks. "We need the money," Philip said, too tired to argue. "We need you," Emma replied. Philip looked at his wife, beautiful, patient Emma, who'd stuck by him through 12 years of unpredictable schedules and trauma and the constant fear that one day he might not come home. He saw the worry lines forming around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm sorry. I'll do better." He meant it. He always meant it. But something else was about to complicate everything. In April 2005, Engine 19 responded to a small electrical fire at a construction site downtown. The Brennan Tower, a luxury high-rise development that was supposed to be Marcus Brennan's masterpiece, his legacy project. The fire was minor, contained to a temporary electrical panel on the 15th floor. But while clearing the building, Philip noticed things that made his blood run cold. Faulty wiring running through walls without proper insulation. Emergency exit doors chained shut. Missing fire suppression systems that should have been installed weeks ago. Exposed gas lines running next to exposed electrical conduit. It was a disaster waiting to happen. "Captain," Philip said after the fire was out. "You need to see this." Captain Holcomb took one look and went pale. Jesus Christ. They filed a report with the Wisconsin Department of Commerce. An inspector came out the next day. The violations were even worse than Philip had described. The project was shut down pending a full safety review. Marcus Brennan lost millions in delays, penalties, and mandatory safety upgrades. He was not a man who took kindly to losing millions. 2 days after the inspection report went public, Philip got the first phone call. He was at home just finishing dinner with Emma and Grace. "Hello." Silence on the other end. Then a low voice, "You should have minded your own business." Click. Philip stared at the phone, his appetite gone. "Who was it?" Emma asked. "Wrong number," Philip lied. But he knew. Deep in his gut, he knew. The calls continued over the next few weeks. Always at night. Always the same thing, silence, then a threat, then a dial tone. Philip reported them to the police, but without caller ID or a way to trace the calls, there was nothing they could do. "It's probably just someone's idea of a prank," Officer Daniel Briggs said when he took Philip's statement at the station. Briggs was a patrol cop, relatively new to the department, eager to be helpful but ultimately powerless to stop anonymous phone calls. "You should take it seriously," Philip insisted. "I testified against Marcus Brennan. He's got connections." "I understand you're concerned," Briggs said in that placating tone cops use when they think you're overreacting. "But we can't arrest someone based on anonymous calls. If anything escalates, call us immediately." Philip left the police station feeling frustrated and afraid. He should have listened to that fear. November 14, 2005, started like any other Tuesday. Philip worked a 24-hour shift, responding to 2 car accidents, a kitchen fire, and a medical emergency where an elderly man had fallen down his basement stairs. He came home Wednesday morning exhausted, his uniform smelling like smoke and sweat. Emma was already up, making breakfast before her drive to Riverside Elementary. The kitchen smelled like coffee and toast. Morning light streamed through the windows, catching dust motes and golden beams. "You look tired," Emma said, kissing him on the cheek. "I am tired," Philip admitted, sinking into a chair at the kitchen table. Grace came bounding into the room, still in her star-patterned pajamas, her brown hair wild from sleep. "Daddy," she shouted, launching herself into his lap. Philip caught her, laughing despite his exhaustion. "Hey, Grace the Brave. Guess what? Pickles, that's the guinea pig in Mrs. Henderson's class. Pickles did the funniest thing yesterday." He squeaked really loud during reading time and Madison dropped her book and everyone laughed. "Sounds like Pickles is a troublemaker," Philip said, smoothing down her hair. "He's my best friend," Grace said seriously. "Even better than Madison, and Madison shares her fruit snacks." "That's pretty serious," Philip replied. "I know." Emma smiled at them from the stove, her 2 favorite people in the whole world, tired firefighter and energetic 6-year-old. This was what mattered. Not the bills or the stress or the threatening phone calls. Grace eventually climbed down to eat her cereal. Emma packed her lunch, peanut butter and jelly, apple slices, the cookies they'd baked together on Sunday. Philip drank his coffee and tried to stay awake long enough to be present, to be here, in this moment that felt so ordinary it must be sacred. After Emma and Grace left, Emma for school, Grace for the bus stop at the end of the block, Philip showered and fell into bed, too tired to even close the curtains. He slept until 4 in the afternoon. When he woke, the house was quiet. Emma wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. Grace was at her friend Madison's house for a playdate. Philip made himself a sandwich and went out to the garage to work on the bookshelf he'd been building for Grace's room. The garage was his sanctuary, organized and clean, tools hung on pegboards, the smell of sawdust and wood stain. He measured and cut and sanded, losing himself in the simple rhythm of creation. At 7:30, Emma's car pulled into the driveway. Grace came running into the garage talking a mile a minute about the playdate, about how Madison's mom made them hot chocolate, about how they'd watched Finding Nemo for the 100th time. "You should come inside," Emma said, standing in the doorway. Dinner's almost ready. 5 more minutes, Philip said, focused on getting a joint exactly right. I'm almost done with this section. Emma smiled and shook her head. Don't be long. Those were the last words his wife ever spoke to him. At 10:23 p.m., Emma Wallace called 911. Philip was still in the garage, putting the finishing touches on Grace's bookshelf, a beer sitting forgotten on his workbench. He was thinking about how proud Grace would be when she saw it finished, about how her face would light up when they stained it together, her small hands wrapped around the brush while he guided her. Inside the house, Emma was grating papers at the kitchen table, a mug of tea cooling beside her laptop. She heard glass breaking. Not loud. Not like someone smashing a window. Just a quiet pop from somewhere in the living room. Like something had fallen. Emma stood up, listening. "Hello?" she called out. Silence. She walked slowly toward the living room, her heart starting to pound. The house felt wrong somehow. The air felt different. That's when she saw him. A man in dark clothes. A mask covering his face. Standing in her living room, holding something in his hand, something that glinted in the lamplight. A lighter. Emma's training as a mother kicked in immediately. Grace was upstairs. Asleep. Vulnerable. She ran for the phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's in my house. Emma's voice was tight with fear, barely above a whisper. She was moving toward the stairs as she spoke, toward her daughter, toward the one thing that mattered more than anything. Ma'am, are you safe? Can you get out of the house? I heard glass breaking. My daughter's upstairs. The masked man moved fast. Too fast. Emma saw him raise his arm. Saw the metal canister in his other hand. Saw him squeeze the lighter. He's wearing a mask. Oh God, he has something in his hand. The line went dead. Philip was reaching for his beer when he heard Emma scream. The sound cut through the closed garage door, through the night air, through everything. It was a scream of pure terror, the sound a mother makes when her child is in danger. Philip dropped his tools and ran. He hit the door leading from the garage into the house just as the explosion ripped through the living room. The force threw him backward, slammed him against the garage wall. His head cracked against the concrete. Stars burst behind his eyes. The last thing Philip Wallace saw before darkness took him was flames, great tongues of orange and yellow, consuming his home, consuming everything he loved. The last thing he thought was, Grace. Philip woke up on his front lawn. His lungs burned with every breath. His head felt like it had been split open. When he tried to sit up, someone pushed him back down, gently but firmly. Easy, Phil. Don't move. Philip's vision swam. He could make out shapes. Blue and red lights flashing. People running. And behind it all, flames. His house was an inferno. Emma, Philip croaked. Grace. They're inside. The firefighter kneeling beside him, Tom Martinez from Engine 19, one of Philip's best friends, had tears running down his soot-stained face. We're doing everything we can, Tom said. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Philip tried to stand, to run back toward the flames. It took 3 men to hold him down. He fought them anyway, screaming his wife's name, screaming for his daughter, screaming until his voice gave out and the paramedics sedated him. When he woke in the hospital 6 hours later, Captain Holcomb was sitting beside his bed, his face gray with grief. I'm sorry, Phil, was all he said. Philip knew. Of course he knew. But hearing it was different. Emma didn't make it. The smoke. Captain Holcomb's voice broke. Grace was in her room. Emma got to her, Phil. She got to her and held her. They were together. Philip turned his face away and wept. Fire Marshal Thomas Kelly and Detective Harlan Pierce arrived at the scene while it was still smoldering. Pierce was a 20-year veteran of the Milwaukee Police Department. Sharp, ambitious, and known for closing cases quickly. Too quickly, some said. But his conviction rate was impressive, and that's what mattered in a department stretched thin by budget cuts and political pressure. What we got? Pierce asked, surveying the destruction. Kelly, a heavy-set man with a gray mustache and 30 years of arson investigation under his belt, walked Pierce through the scene. Point of origin appears to be here in the garage. Accelerant pattern suggests gasoline, poured deliberately through the first floor. Secondary ignition in the living room. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. You're saying arson. I'm saying this wasn't an accident. Pierce nodded slowly, his mind already working through scenarios. The husband. Philip Wallace. He was in the garage when it happened? Found unconscious on the front lawn. Says he doesn't remember anything after hearing his wife scream. Convenient. Kelly shot Pierce a look. Phil Wallace is a firefighter. A good one. He saved more lives than you and I put together. Maybe, Pierce said. Or maybe he's someone who knows exactly how to set a fire. Over the next 72 hours the evidence mounted. Philip's clothes, the ones he'd been wearing that night, tested positive for accelerant residue. Gasoline. The same accelerant found throughout the house. An empty gas can was recovered from the garage debris. Philip's fingerprints were all over it. Financial records showed the Wallaces were struggling. Credit card debt. A second mortgage. Life insurance policies on Emma and Grace worth $500,000 combined. And then came the testimony that would seal Philip's fate. Officer Daniel Briggs, a 26-year-old patrol cop who'd been one of the first responders on scene, filed a supplemental report 3 days after the fire. In it, he claimed that Philip had confessed while being treated by paramedics. He was barely conscious, Briggs wrote. But I heard him say clear as day, I did it. God forgive me, I did it. When questioned, Briggs stood by his statement. No, he didn't have a recording. No, there were no other witnesses. The paramedics had been focused on treatment, not listening to what the patient was saying. But Briggs was certain of what he'd heard. Detective Pierce took the statement and ran with it. Philip Wallace was arrested 2 weeks after burying his wife and daughter. The prosecution's case was devastating in its simplicity. Philip Wallace, under financial pressure and suffering from untreated PTSD, had snapped. He'd planned the murder carefully, using his knowledge as a firefighter to create a fire that would destroy evidence. He'd killed his wife and daughter for insurance money. The accelerant on his clothes, the gas can with his prints, the financial motive, and most damning of all, his own confession to Officer Briggs. Philip's public defender, Sarah Chin, an overworked attorney in her second year out of law school, tried her best. But she was outmatched, underfunded, and dealing with a client who was so hollowed out by grief that he could barely function. No expert witnesses challenged the accelerant analysis. No private investigator looked into Philip's claims about threatening phone calls or his testimony against Marcus Brennan. No forensic specialist questioned why a decorated firefighter would use such an obvious accelerant pattern if he was trying to hide a crime. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Philip sat in the courtroom every day, wearing an ill-fitting suit provided by the public defender's office, his face blank, his eyes empty. He'd lost 30 pounds. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He looked like a ghost of the man he'd been. Emma's sister, Jennifer, sat in the front row of the gallery, clutching a framed photo of Grace in her little fire helmet. She stared at Philip with undisguised hatred. When Officer Daniel Briggs took the stand to testify about the confession, Philip finally showed some emotion. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on Briggs, searching the younger man's face. Officer Briggs, the prosecutor said, can you tell the court what the defendant said to you at the scene? Briggs shifted in his seat. He wouldn't meet Philip's eyes. He said, I did it. God forgive me, I did it. And you're certain those were his exact words? Yes, sir. No doubt in your mind? No doubt. But Briggs's hand moved to his pocket, and Philip saw it, a small silver cross clutched between the officer's fingers. Briggs's knuckles were white, his jaw clenched. He was lying. Philip knew it in that moment with absolute certainty. Briggs was lying and the guilt was eating him alive. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. On a cold afternoon in September 2006, the jury returned after 6 hours of deliberation. The courtroom was packed. Media filled the back rows. Emma's family sat on the right side. Philip's mother, Carol, sat alone on the left, rosary beads wrapped around her trembling fingers. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Margaret Hartwell asked. We have, Your Honor. The forewoman stood, holding a piece of paper that would determine the rest of Philip Wallace's life. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Emma Wallace, how do you find? Guilty. Carol Wallace let out a sob. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Grace Wallace, how do you find? Guilty. Jennifer collapsed in the gallery, wailing. The sound of her grief filled the courtroom like smoke. Philip didn't react. He simply stared at the defense table, at his cuffed hands, at nothing. In the witness gallery, Officer Daniel Briggs sat frozen, his hand still clutching that silver cross, his eyes squeezed shut. I'm sorry, he thought but didn't say. God forgive me, I'm sorry. But sorry wasn't enough. Sorry wouldn't bring Emma and Grace Wallace back. Sorry wouldn't save the innocent man he just helped condemn to death. The judge set sentencing for 2 weeks later. As the bailiffs led Philip away in chains, he turned his head one last time. His eyes found Officer Daniel Briggs. Briggs finally looked back. For 3 seconds their gazes locked. And in that moment Philip saw it all, the guilt, the fear, the terrible knowledge of what Briggs had done. "You lied," Philip's eyes said. "I know," Briggs's eyes replied. Then Philip was gone, disappeared behind the courtroom doors, and Daniel Briggs was left alone with the cross burning like hot metal in his palm and a conscience that would haunt him for the next 9 years. Officer Marcus Webb filed no report about the child's laughter. But he told the other guards during shift change, his voice low and uncertain, like a man confessing something he wasn't sure he believed himself. "I'm telling you, I heard it. Clear as day. A little girl laughing." Officer Ryan Holt, 24 years old and fresh out of the academy, looked skeptical. "You sure you weren't dozing off? Night shifts mess with your head." "I wasn't asleep," Webb insisted. "It came from right outside Wallace's cell. And when I checked on him, he was praying. Just sitting there with that prayer card, praying like his life depended on it." "His life does depend on it," said Officer Daniel Briggs quietly from the corner of the break room. "He's got less than 24 hours. The other officers fell silent. Everyone knew about Philip Wallace's execution date. October 30, 2014 at 12:01 a.m. The warden had already assigned the escort detail. 4 officers to walk a condemned man to his death. Briggs was one of them. He looked like hell. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. His hands trembled slightly as he poured his 4th cup of coffee that morning. The other officers had noticed but said nothing. Everyone dealt with execution duty differently. They didn't know that Daniel Briggs hadn't slept more than 2 hours a night in the past week. They didn't know about the nightmares that jerked him awake in the darkness of his bedroom, his sheets soaked with sweat, his wife Sarah asking what was wrong while he lied and said it was nothing. The nightmares were always the same. Smoke and fire. A house burning. And through the flames, a little girl in star-patterned pajamas and a fire helmet, calling his name. "Daniel," the dream Grace would say. "Why did you lie about my daddy?" He'd wake up gasping, the smell of smoke so real he'd check the house to make sure nothing was burning. But it was never real smoke. Just the ghost of a lie that had been eating him alive for 9 years. "Briggs, you good for tonight?" Warden Callahan asked, appearing in the doorway of the break room. Briggs straightened, trying to look more alert than he felt. "Yes, sir." "You don't look good." "I'm fine. Just haven't been sleeping well." The warden studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. You Webb, Holt, and Patterson. Final escort at 11 p.m. Wallace requested to visit the chapel before the procedure." "The chapel?" Patterson, a stocky officer with 15 years on death row, raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual." "He wants to see the statue of the Virgin Mary. Says it's his only request." Webb and Holt exchanged glances, thinking of the child's laughter in the corridor. Neither spoke. "We're honoring it," Warden Callahan continued. "Last thing we need is public outrage over denying a condemned man's final religious request. So you'll escort him to the chapel. Father Gabriel will be there. 10 minutes, then we proceed to the execution chamber." "Yes, sir," the 4 officers said in unison. After the warden left, Patterson shook his head. 9 years I've been doing this job. Never gets easier." "You think he did it?" Holt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Wallace, I mean. You think he really killed his family?" "Jury said he did," Patterson replied. "Evidence said he did. That's good enough for me." But Briggs said nothing. He stared into his coffee cup, seeing his own distorted reflection in the dark liquid, and thought about a little girl in a fire helmet asking why he'd lied about her daddy. That afternoon, Father Gabriel Mackenzie prepared the chapel for Philip's final visit. The elderly priest moved slowly through the small room, lighting candles one by one, their flames casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood in the corner, exactly as it had for the past 20 years. White marble, painted in traditional colors, blue robes, white veil, hands open in eternal welcome. Her face was serene, peaceful, with eyes that seemed to follow you no matter where you stood in the room. Father Gabriel had grown fond of that statue over his decades at Waupun. He'd seen countless men kneel before it, some genuine in their faith, others making desperate bargains with a God they'd ignored all their lives. But something about Philip Wallace's request felt different. The priest had watched Philip's transformation over the past year. Seen the hollow man slowly fill with something that looked like peace. Not happiness, you couldn't be happy on death row, but a deep, quiet acceptance that Father Gabriel recognized as grace. "Watch over him tonight, Mother," Father Gabriel whispered to the statue as he lit the last candle. "Whatever happens, watch over that boy." The statue of course said nothing. Just stood in its corner with that gentle, sorrowful expression, hands open like an offering or a question. At 6 p.m., the 4 officers gathered for their briefing. Standard procedure for an execution escort. Patterson went over the protocol, the route they'd take from cell block H to the chapel, then from the chapel to the execution chamber. The timing. The contingency plans if the prisoner became violent or tried to resist. Wallace won't resist, Webb said quietly. I've been watching him. He's ready. Ready to die for something he didn't do? Holt said before he could stop himself. The room went silent. Patterson glared at the young officer. You got something to say, Holt? No, sir. Just, the guy's been claiming innocence for 9 years. What if? What if doesn't matter? Patterson cut him off. The court's decided. Our job is to carry out the sentence, not question it. But Holt's words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel Briggs felt them settle on his shoulders like physical weight, pressing down, suffocating. At 10:30 p.m., the 4 officers made their way to cell block H. The prison had gone quiet, that particular kind of quiet that happens when everyone knows someone is about to die. Even the usual noise from the other cell blocks, the shouting, the arguing, the TV sounds, had muted to nothing. Philip Wallace was sitting on his bunk, dressed in his orange jumpsuit, the prayer card held loosely in his hands. He looked calm. More than calm. He looked like a man who'd already made peace with what was coming. Time, Wallace, Warden Callahan said. Philip stood without hesitation. He set the prayer card carefully on his thin pillow, then held out his wrists for the cuffs. As Briggs stepped forward to secure the restraints, his hands were shaking so badly he almost couldn't fasten them. Philip's eyes met his, steady, knowing, impossibly forgiving. It's okay, Philip said quietly so only Briggs could hear. I forgive you. Briggs's hands froze. How could Wallace know? How could he possibly know? But those eyes said everything. Philip knew. Had known probably since the trial. Since that moment in the courtroom when their gazes locked and the truth passed between them like a current. The walk to the chapel took 3 minutes but felt like 3 hours. Past the other cells, past the condemned men who called out blessings and curses in equal measure. Through 2 security doors. Down a corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and decades of despair. They reached the chapel at 10:55 p.m. Father Gabriel was waiting inside, standing beside the statue like a guardian. The candles he'd lit threw golden light across the marble features of the Virgin Mary, making her eyes seem almost alive. Give us a moment, Father Gabriel said softly. Let the man pray. Warden Callahan hesitated, then nodded. 10 minutes. We'll be right outside. No, Philip said suddenly, his voice hoarse but firm. Let them stay. Everyone turned to look at him. Whatever happens, Philip continued, his eyes fixed on the statue, I want witnesses. There was something in his tone, not desperation, not fear, but absolute certainty. Like he knew something they didn't. Like he was waiting for something. All right, Warden Callahan said slowly. Officers remain inside. Stay by the walls. The 4 guards positioned themselves around the perimeter of the chapel. Briggs chose a spot as far from Philip as possible, his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his heart hammering in his chest. Philip walked forward slowly, his chains clinking with each step. When he reached the statue, he lowered himself carefully to his knees, his cuffed hands clasped in front of him. For a long moment he simply knelt there, breathing. Then he whispered, so quietly that only those closest could hear. If I die innocent, let them see it. The candles flickered once. The air in the chapel seemed to shift, like the pressure had dropped suddenly. Officer Holt felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Philip closed his eyes and began to pray. The words of the Hail Mary, whispered in a voice that cracked with emotion but never wavered. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Briggs's hands clenched into fists. His breath came short and fast. The chapel walls seemed to be closing in, the air growing thick and hard to breathe. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. The candles flickered again. All of them in perfect unison as if touched by the same invisible breath. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. Briggs closed his eyes, but he could still see Grace in her fire helmet. Could still hear her voice calling his name through the smoke. Now and at the hour of our death. The chapel clock on the wall began to chime. Midnight. 12 slow, measured tones that seemed to echo not just in the room but in Briggs's chest, in his bones, in his guilty soul. And between the 11th and 12th chime, in the silence that hung like a held breath, a voice whispered through the chapel. Not Philip's voice. Not any of the guards. Not Father Gabriel's. A voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, soft as falling snow but impossible to ignore. You lied, Daniel. Officer Daniel Briggs's eyes flew open. His hand went to his chest, clutching at the silver cross in his pocket. The one he'd been carrying for 9 years, the one he could never bring himself to throw away. Every man in that chapel heard it. Every man froze, looking around, trying to find the source. But there was no one else there. Just 7 men, 1 statue, and a truth that was about to break free. The candles flared brighter. The air grew warmer. And Philip Wallace, still kneeling before the Virgin Mary, opened his eyes and smiled. Because he knew. He'd known since the dream started. Since Grace had told him, night after night in that field of white flowers. The truth is coming. And it was here. The whisper hung in the air like incense, invisible but undeniable. You lied, Daniel. Officer Daniel Briggs stood frozen against the chapel wall, his silver cross cutting into his palm where he gripped it, his chest heaving. The other guards looked around wildly, trying to locate the source of the voice. But there was no source. There was only the statue with its painted eyes and the condemned man kneeling before it. Philip Wallace continued praying, his voice steady now, building in strength. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women. The fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker. What? Twice. Then they started to dim, slowly, as if someone were turning down a switch that didn't exist. Officer Holt reached instinctively for his flashlight, but Warden Callahan held up a hand, stopping him. Because something else was happening. The candles that Father Gabriel had lit, 7 of them arranged around the chapel, began to burn brighter. Not the normal brightening of a candle catching more oxygen, but an impossible intensification, as if each flame had suddenly remembered what fire was supposed to be. The golden light they cast grew stronger, richer, filling the chapel with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. And blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. The marble statue stood as it always had in the corner, unchanged and unchanging. But something about it was different now. The painted eyes, simple, flat pigment on carved stone, seemed to catch the candlelight in a way they never had before. They reflected the gold. They reflected the flames. They seemed almost, Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners. Officer Webb took a step forward, his hand outstretched as if to touch something he couldn't quite see. His mouth opened but no words came out. He was staring at the statue's face, at eyes that were definitely, impossibly looking back. Now and at the hour of our death. Amen. Philip lifted his head. Tears streamed down his face, catching the golden light, turning each drop into liquid amber. His expression was one of pure, transcendent peace, the look of a man who'd been carrying an unbearable weight and finally felt it lift. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you for hearing me. The fluorescent lights dimmed further, until the chapel was lit only by candlelight. But the candles kept burning brighter, kept pushing back the darkness with that impossible golden glow that seemed to have substance, seemed to have weight. Father Gabriel Mackenzie felt it first. A wave of warmth that passed through him like water, like light, like love itself. It started at his chest and radiated outward, filling his lungs, his limbs, his old tired bones that ached with every Milwaukee winter. The warmth was impossible to describe. It was comfort and joy and forgiveness all at once. It was every good thing he'd ever felt in 70 years of living, concentrated into a single moment. The priest's knees buckled. He caught himself on one of the folding chairs, his weathered hands gripping the metal back, his eyes wide and wet with tears. Oh, he breathed. Oh my God. Officer Patterson, the veteran who'd seen 15 years of executions and thought nothing could surprise him anymore, backed against the wall. His tough guy expression cracked like thin ice. His hands were shaking. What the hell is happening? He whispered. But no one answered. Because everyone in that chapel could feel it now, the air itself changing, becoming thicker, more present. It hummed with something that had no name. The scent of lilies filled the room, sweet and clean and absolutely impossible. There were no flowers in the chapel. There were no flowers anywhere in Waupun Correctional Institution. But the scent was undeniable. Officer Ryan Holt dropped to his knees, not from devotion but from sheer overwhelm. He was 24 years old, raised Catholic but lapsed, hadn't been to Mass since his confirmation. But he knew what he was feeling. Deep in his bones, in some part of him that remembered childhood prayers and his grandmother's rosary beads, he knew. Holy Mary, Mother of God, he whispered, the words coming without thought. The statue's hand, the left one, positioned in that eternal gesture of offering, seemed to move. Not physically. The marble didn't shift, didn't change position. But there was a sense of motion, of intentionality, as if the hand that had been carved in stone 100 years ago was only now fulfilling its purpose. As if it had been waiting, patient as only stone can be, for this exact moment. The hand seemed to lift slightly toward Philip. Reaching. Beckoning. Blessing. Philip saw it. His sob was audible now, a sound of pure relief and vindication. He reached up with his cuffed hands, stretching toward that marble hand that seemed so impossibly alive. "I knew you'd come," he said. "She told me you would. Grace told me." The light around the candles intensified further. It began to spread, moving across the chapel floor like luminous fog, swirling around Philip's kneeling form. Not harsh light. Not the cold white of fluorescence or the yellow of standard bulbs. This was golden and warm and alive, and it seemed to recognize Philip, seemed to know him, seemed to wrap around him like a mother's embrace. Officer Webb was crying now, tears streaming down his face unchecked. He didn't understand what he was seeing. Didn't have words for it. But he felt it in every cell of his body, the presence of something vast and gentle and absolutely real. "I heard her," Webb said to no one in particular. "Last night. I heard the little girl laughing. I thought I was crazy, but she was here. She was here." The light around Philip grew brighter still, forming what could only be described as a halo. It wrapped around his head, his shoulders, his chest. It made his orange jumpsuit look like royal robes. It made his tear-stained face look like the face of a saint. Warden Callahan stood transfixed, his hand still on his radio but making no move to call for backup, to stop what was happening. He was 61 years old, a pragmatist, a man who believed in procedures and protocols and the concrete reality of steel bars and locked doors. But pragmatism had no answer for this. "My God," he breathed. But Daniel Briggs saw something different. While the others saw light and felt peace, Briggs saw the statue's eyes turn toward him. Not the benevolent gaze the others experienced. These eyes held knowledge. These eyes held truth. These eyes saw straight through him to the lie he'd been carrying for 9 years. The Virgin Mary was looking at him. Not the statue. Not the painted marble. The woman herself, somehow present, somehow real, was looking directly at Daniel Briggs, and her expression was one of profound sorrow. Not anger. Sorrow. The sorrow of a mother watching her child choose darkness over light. The sorrow of someone who knew exactly what he'd done and exactly how much it had cost. "No," Briggs whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." The silver cross in his hand felt like it was burning. Not metaphorically burning. Actually burning, searing his palm with heat that should have been impossible from metal that hadn't been near any flame. The eyes kept watching him. Kept knowing him. The light around Philip grew brighter, and now Briggs could see something else in that light. Shapes. Forms. Not quite solid but not quite transparent. A woman with brown hair and kind eyes, her hand on Philip's shoulder. A little girl in star-patterned pajamas and a fire helmet, smiling that gap-toothed smile. Emma and Grace. Here. Present. Witnessing. "She's looking at me," Briggs said, his voice rising. "She's looking at me." He wasn't talking about Emma or Grace. He was talking about the statue, about the Virgin Mary, about the presence that filled the chapel like water fills a cup. The presence that knew. That saw. That waited with infinite patience for him to speak the truth he'd buried for 9 years. "She knows," Briggs gasped. "She knows what I did." Father Gabriel turned toward him, his face still wet with tears but his expression compassionate. "Then tell her, son. Tell all of us." "I can't." "You can." The priest's voice was gentle but firm. "You must." The light intensified. The scent of lilies grew stronger. The air hummed like the world was holding its breath, waiting for a truth to finally break free. Briggs looked at Philip, still kneeling in that impossible light. Looked at the statue with its knowing eyes. Looked at the faces of Emma and Grace, barely visible in the golden glow but undeniably there. Undeniably present. Undeniably waiting. His chest felt like it was being crushed. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might break his ribs. The cross in his hand burned hotter, and somewhere in his mind, he heard that child's voice again. "Why did you lie about my daddy?" "I'm sorry," Briggs whispered. "God help me, I'm sorry." The chapel clock ticked. 1 second. 2. 3. And then Daniel Briggs opened his mouth and screamed. Not words. Just sound. Pure agony, 9 years of guilt and shame and self-hatred compressed into a single cry that echoed off the concrete walls and seemed to shake the very foundation of the prison. He clutched his chest with both hands, the silver cross falling to the floor with a metallic ping that sounded impossibly loud in the aftermath of his scream. "She's looking at me," he shouted, pointing at the statue with a trembling hand. "She sees what I did. She sees." His legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, then forward onto his hands, his whole body shaking like he was caught in an earthquake that only he could feel. "I lied." The words burst from him like blood from a wound. "I lied about the confession." He never said it. Wallace never said, "I did it." There was no confession. The other guards stared at him in shock. Warden Callahan took a step forward, his face pale. "Briggs, what are you?" He never confessed. Briggs was sobbing now, the words coming in great heaving gasps. "Pierce told me to say it." Detective Pierce said they needed the confession to make the case stick. Said Wallace was guilty anyway, that the evidence proved it, that I'd be a hero for putting away a child killer. Officer Patterson's hand went to his weapon instinctively, though he didn't draw it. "Jesus Christ, Briggs." "I heard him at the scene," Briggs continued, the truth pouring out of him like poison from a lanced wound. "I heard Wallace saying Emma and Grace. Their names, just their names, over and over." He was barely conscious. There was no confession. But Pierce said it didn't matter, that the physical evidence was enough, that my testimony would just seal it. He looked up at Philip, his face twisted with anguish. "I'm sorry. God help me, I'm sorry. You were innocent and I knew it and I said nothing. I let them kill your family twice, once in the fire and again when I helped put you on death row." The light around Philip pulsed, grew brighter still. The Virgin Mary's stone face seemed to glow from within, as if the marble itself was becoming translucent, as if something infinitely greater was shining through the material form. Father Gabriel made the sign of the cross, his hands shaking. "Merciful God." Officer Holt fumbled for his radio, then stopped. What would he even say? How could he describe what was happening in words that would make sense? Warden Callahan's face was ashen. "Briggs, do you understand what you're saying? Do you understand the implications?" "I understand," Briggs screamed. "I understand I helped murder an innocent man. I understand I've been living in hell for 9 years. I understand she's here and she sees and she knows." He pointed again at the statue, at those eyes that held universes of compassion and justice intertwined. "She's looking at me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She sees everything. And I can't carry it anymore. I can't." Daniel Briggs collapsed fully then, his forehead pressed against the cold concrete floor, his body racked with sobs that sounded like they were tearing him apart from the inside out. And in that moment, as the truth finally broke free after 9 years of imprisonment, the light in the chapel blazed so bright that Officer Webb had to shield his eyes. The candles burned like small suns. The air shimmered with heat that didn't burn. The scent of lilies became overwhelming, beautiful, undeniable. And the statue, the simple marble statue that had stood in that corner for 20 years, seemed to smile. Not a movement of stone. Not a trick of light. But a smile nonetheless, felt by every man in that room, a smile of profound love and profound vindication. The truth had been spoken. The innocent had been declared. And mercy, terrible and beautiful, had entered a room built for death. Philip Wallace, still kneeling in that golden light, looked up at the Virgin Mary's face and whispered, "Thank you for Grace. Thank you for Emma. Thank you for bringing the truth home." And somewhere, in the space between the candlelight and the impossible glow, a child's laughter echoed through the chapel one more time, joyful, free and finally at peace. The child's laughter faded into silence, but its echo remained, not in the air, but in the hearts of every man who heard it. Daniel Briggs lay collapsed on the chapel floor, his body still shaking with sobs, the weight of 9 years finally, devastatingly lifted. Officer Ryan Holt was the first to move. His hands were trembling as he pulled out his phone, not his radio, his personal phone. Some part of him understood that what was happening in this chapel needed to be documented, needed to be preserved because no one would believe it otherwise. He held up the phone, his finger hovering over the record button. The screen showed the chapel, the candles, the statue bathed in that impossible golden light. But where the Virgin Mary should have been, there was nothing but a column of overexposed white brilliance, pure light that the camera couldn't capture, couldn't contain, couldn't explain. "Are you recording this?" Officer Patterson asked, his voice hoarse. Holt nodded, unable to speak. His phone screen showed everything except what mattered most. The guards were visible. Philip kneeling in that luminous glow was visible. Father Gabriel with tears streaming down his weathered face was visible. But the statue, the source of all that light, was nothing but white. Blown out. Overexposed. as if the camera was looking directly at the sun. "It's not capturing her," Holt whispered. "The light, it's too much for the sensor." Warden Callahan stepped forward, his training finally overriding his shock. "Briggs. Officer Briggs, can you hear me?" Briggs didn't respond. He remained on the floor, his forehead pressed against the concrete, his shoulders heaving. "Daniel." Father Gabriel's voice cut through the moment with surprising authority. The elderly priest moved toward Briggs slowly, his joints protesting but his purpose clear. "Daniel, look at me." Briggs lifted his head slowly. His face was destroyed, red and swollen, tears and snot mixing together, every defense stripped away. He looked like a man who'd been hollowed out and was only now feeling vainess inside him. "I can't take it back," Briggs said, his voice raw. 9 years. I can't give him back 9 years. "No," Father Gabriel agreed, kneeling beside him with difficulty. "You can't. But you can give him the truth. And truth, Daniel, is what sets all of us free." The light around Philip continued to pulse, continued to glow. Philip himself remained kneeling, his cuffed hands still raised toward the statue, his face turned upward like a man receiving benediction. The tears on his cheeks caught the golden light and seemed to glow with it. Warden Callahan pulled out his radio, his hand shaking slightly. "This is Callahan. I need the duty sergeant and the recording officer to the chapel immediately. And someone get me the Attorney General's emergency line." "Sir?" The voice on the radio was confused. "The execution is scheduled." "The execution is on hold," Callahan said firmly. "We have new evidence. Critical evidence. Just get me those people now." Officer Patterson moved to Briggs, his earlier hostility replaced with something more complex. Shock, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. "Briggs, you need to tell them everything. Detective Pierce, the orders he gave you, all of it." Briggs nodded weakly. "There's more. God help me, there's so much more." "Then say it." Philip spoke for the first time since his prayer ended. His voice was gentle, forgiving in a way that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "Say it all, Daniel. For Emma. For Grace. For the truth." The light seemed to pulse in agreement, growing warmer, more encompassing. Briggs pulled himself to a sitting position, his back against the chapel wall. His face was a mess, but his eyes were clearer now, the eyes of a man who'd finally stopped running from himself. "Detective Harlan Pierce ran the investigation," Briggs began, his voice steadying as the confession continued. "But he wasn't just investigating. He was covering something up. I didn't understand it at first. Thought he was just a cop trying to close a case." "What was he covering?" Warden Callahan asked, his radio still in hand. "There were other fires. Before the Wallace house. 4 of them over 6 months, all in the same neighborhood. All ruled accidental, but the patterns were similar. Insurance fires we suspected, but we could never prove it." Officer Holt adjusted his phone, still recording, capturing Briggs's confession even if it couldn't capture the miracle happening around them. "The Wallace fire was different," Briggs continued. "Too public. A firefighter's family. Media attention. Pierce needed it closed fast, needed someone to blame. When Wallace ended up unconscious on the lawn with accelerant on his clothes, Pierce saw his opportunity. But the evidence was real," Patterson interjected. "The gas can, the fingerprints." "The evidence was manufactured," Briggs said, and the words seemed to take the last of his strength. "Not all of it. There was accelerant at the scene. There was a fire. But the can with Wallace's prints? Pierce planted it. Took it from Wallace's garage during the initial investigation. Made sure it ended up in the debris in exactly the right place." Father Gabriel closed his eyes, his lips moving in silent prayer. "And the 911 call from Emma Wallace?" Warden Callahan asked. "The one where she said there was an intruder?" Briggs's face crumpled again. "Pierce buried it. Had it misfiled in the system. Said it was from a different incident, a different address. I didn't know about it until months after the trial, and by then..." He gestured helplessly. "By then I'd already committed perjury. Already helped convict an innocent man. What was I supposed to do? Come forward and admit I'd lied? Admit we'd all lied?" "Yes," Philip said simply. "That's exactly what you should have done." The rebuke was gentle but absolute. Briggs flinched as if struck. "I know," he whispered. "I know." The golden light around Philip began to change. Not dimming but transforming, becoming softer, more diffuse, spreading throughout the chapel like dawn breaking. It touched each man in the room and each man felt it differently. Officer Webb felt forgiveness washing over him for sins he didn't even remember committing. Officer Patterson felt the burden of 15 years of executions lifting slightly, the weight of all those deaths he'd witnessed becoming somehow more bearable. Officer Holt felt his lapsed faith stirring, remembered prayers returning like long-lost friends. And Warden Callahan felt the terrible responsibility of his position, the lives he'd ended in the name of justice, crack open to reveal the possibility that justice and mercy might somehow be the same thing. "There's a ledger," Briggs said, his confession accelerating now, the dam finally broken. "Pierce kept records. Shell companies, payment transfers, dates and addresses of the fires. I saw it once in his office years ago. Didn't understand what I was looking at until later. He's connected to a real estate developer, Marcus Brennan. The same one Wallace testified against." Philip's head snapped toward Briggs. "Brennan?" "Marcus Brennan paid Pierce. Through intermediaries. Insurance companies, construction firms, layers of protection. But yeah, Wallace cost Brennan millions with that safety report. And Brennan doesn't forget. So they killed my family," Philip said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was hearing. "They killed Emma and Grace to punish me. And then they framed me for it." "Yes." Briggs's voice was barely audible. "God forgive me, yes." The light pulsed again, and for just a moment, just a heartbeat, everyone in the chapel could see them clearly. Emma Wallace, her hand on Philip's shoulder, smiling with infinite gentleness. Grace, dancing in a circle around her father, her fire helmet askew, her laughter silent but somehow audible in their hearts. And behind them both, the woman in blue, taller than life, more real than reality, her eyes holding every sorrow and every joy that had ever existed, watched with an expression that contained multitudes. Officer Holt's phone captured none of it. Just the overexposed column of white light where the statue stood. But the audio was clear, Briggs's confession, the sounds of weeping, and at 12:17 a.m., exactly 47 minutes after midnight, a sound that would puzzle audio forensic experts for years to come. A child's voice, clear and bright and impossible, speaking 3 words. "Thank you, officer." Briggs heard it. Everyone heard it. Grace's voice, filled not with accusation but with gratitude, thanking him for finally telling the truth. "I don't deserve that," Briggs sobbed. "I don't deserve her forgiveness." "None of us deserve mercy," Father Gabriel said gently. "That's why it's called grace." The light began to fade then, slowly like the sun setting rather than a bulb switching off. The candles returned to their normal brightness. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered back to life. The scent of lilies lingered but began to dissipate, leaving behind only the familiar smell of concrete and institution. The statue of the Virgin Mary stood in its corner, marble and paint, exactly as it had always been. But something was different now. The expression on her carved face seemed gentler somehow. The eyes seemed to hold a secret. The hands, forever outstretched in offering, seemed to have completed their purpose. Philip Wallace remained kneeling, but his posture had changed. The desperate supplication was gone. He knelt now in thanksgiving, in acknowledgement, in peace. "Your Honor," he said to Warden Callahan, his voice surprisingly strong. "I'd like to request that the execution be postponed until this new testimony can be properly investigated." Callahan almost laughed at the understatement. "Almost. Son, the execution isn't postponed. It's over. After what just happened here, after what Briggs just confessed." He shook his head. "We're calling the governor. Tonight. Now." Officer Holt finally lowered his phone, his hands still shaking. The recording icon blinked, 47 minutes of footage that showed everything and nothing, that captured a confession and a miracle, that documented the moment when heaven broke into a maximum security prison and refused to leave until truth prevailed. "The video," Holt said quietly. "The part with the statue. It's all blown out. White light. No detail." Father Gabriel smiled through his tears. "Some things aren't meant to be seen with cameras, Ryan. They're meant to be witnessed. There's a difference." Philip looked at Briggs, who was still slumped against the wall, exhausted and emptied and somehow paradoxically, more whole than he'd been in 9 years. "I forgive you, Daniel," Philip said. "For Emma. For Grace. For all of it. I forgive you." Briggs lifted his head, his expression stunned. "How can you?" "Because she did." Philip gestured toward the statue. "And if she can forgive, who am I to hold back?" The chapel fell silent. Outside, in the corridors of Waupun Correctional Institution, guards were responding to Warden Callahan's summons. The machinery of justice, which had ground forward inexorably toward Philip Wallace's execution, was about to shift into reverse. But in that moment, in the small chapel with its concrete floor and folding chairs and marble statue that had just hosted a miracle, 7 men stood in the presence of something greater than justice. They stood in the presence of mercy. And mercy, they were learning, changed everything. The phone call to Governor Catherine Mitchell came at 12:43 a.m. She answered on the second ring, already awake. Insomnia had been her companion since taking office 3 years ago. But nothing in her political career had prepared her for what Warden James Callahan was about to tell her. "Governor, I'm calling to request an emergency stay of execution for Philip Wallace." Mitchell sat up in bed, reaching for her reading glasses. "Warden, the execution is scheduled for," she glanced at the clock, 18 minutes ago. "I'm aware, ma'am. But we have new evidence. Critical evidence. Officer Daniel Briggs has confessed to perjury. He's recanting his testimony about Wallace's confession. And there's more, allegations of evidence tampering, corruption, conspiracy. At 1 in the morning? On the night of execution? Governor, I wouldn't make this call if it wasn't urgent. I have Officer Briggs's confession on video. I have multiple witnesses. And I have." Callahan paused, searching for words that wouldn't make him sound insane. "I have reason to believe that Philip Wallace may be innocent." The silence on the other end lasted 5 seconds. Then, "Don't move, Wallace. Don't do anything. I'm issuing an emergency stay effective immediately. And I'm calling the Attorney General." By 2 a.m., Philip Wallace was back in his cell on death row, but everything had changed. He wasn't a condemned man waiting to die anymore. He was a witness. Evidence. The center of a case that was about to explode across Wisconsin and beyond. Officer Holt's phone video had already been uploaded to secure servers. 47 minutes of footage showing Briggs's breakdown and confession, the guards' reactions, and that inexplicable column of white light where the Virgin Mary statue should have been. The audio was crystal clear. Briggs's voice, steady and broken at once, admitting to perjury. Admitting to conspiracy. Naming Detective Harlan Pierce. Father Gabriel sat with Philip in his cell, neither man speaking much. The miracle was still too fresh, too overwhelming for casual conversation. "They'll want to talk to you," the priest said finally. "Investigators. Lawyers. Media if they can get to you. I know. They'll ask you what happened in the chapel." Philip looked at his hands, still able to feel the warmth of that golden light. "What do I tell them?" "The truth. Always the truth. That's what she came for, isn't it? Truth." By dawn, Wisconsin's Attorney General had assembled a task force. 6 prosecutors, 4 investigators, 2 forensic accountants, and a tech specialist who could recover buried files from corrupted systems. Their mandate was simple: find everything. They started with Detective Harlan Pierce. Pierce, now 53 and 3 years into retirement, lived in a lakeside house 40 miles north of Milwaukee, a house far too expensive for a cop's pension. The investigators arrived at 6 a.m. with a search warrant and found his home office locked. "Mr. Pierce, open the door or we'll break it down," Senior Investigator Linda Chin called through the wood. No response. They broke it down. Pierce was already gone, fled through a back window, his car missing from the garage. But he'd left in such a hurry that his computer was still on, files still open. The forensic team descended on it like archaeologists at a fresh dig. What they found was damning. Shell companies. Dozens of them. Registered to false names and P.O. boxes, but all traced back through labyrinthine financial paths to Harlan Pierce and ultimately to Marcus Brennan's real estate empire. Payment ledgers showed deposits corresponding to dates of suspicious fires, 14 arsons over 8 years, each one ruled accidental or inconclusive, each one financially benefiting Brennan. The Wallace House fire was there too. November 14, 2005. Payment received, $75,000. Source: Midwest Property Solutions LLC, a Brennan subsidiary. Jesus Christ, Chin breathed. He was paid to frame Wallace. Paid to destroy evidence. Paid to bury the truth. Her partner, Miguel Santos, was scrolling through emails on Pierce's computer. "Linda, you need to see this." The email was from 3 years ago, sent from Pierce to an unknown recipient using an encrypted service. The recipient's return address was a string of random characters, untraceable. But the message was clear. Wallace problem handled. No appeals left. Execution set for 2014. Brennan will be pleased. Final payment due upon completion. "He's been monitoring Wallace's appeals," Santos said quietly. "Making sure none of them succeeded. Making sure Wallace died before anyone could ask the right questions." Chin pulled out her phone. "We need that 911 recording." The one from Emma Wallace. Find it? I don't care if it was misfiled, deleted, or buried under a mountain of paperwork. Find it. The recording surfaced 6 hours later in a database backup that should have been purged years ago but wasn't. Bureaucratic inefficiency for once serving justice instead of hindering it. A technician named Robert Park, working on his third cup of coffee in second shift, found the file tagged incorrectly, dated wrong, assigned to a different address. He hit play. Emma Wallace's voice, tight with fear. Someone's in my house. I heard glass breaking. My daughter's upstairs. The 911 operator, ma'am, are you safe? Can you get out of the house? Emma, more urgent now, he's wearing a mask. Oh God, he has something in his hand. The line went dead. The timestamp was clear. 10:23 p.m., November 14, 2005. 8 minutes before the fire was reported. 8 minutes when Emma Wallace was alive, terrified, watching a masked intruder prepare to destroy her family. Park sat frozen, his headphones still on, tears running down his face. Then he called Investigator Chin. I found it, he said. And ma'am, we missed it. We had this 9 years ago and we missed it. Not we, Robert. Pierce buried it. Pierce made sure we missed it. The forensic re-examination of the physical evidence began that same day. Dr. Sarah Winters, the state's top arson investigator, reviewed every sample, every report, every conclusion from the original investigation. The accelerant samples from Philip's clothes were the first to crack under scrutiny. This doesn't make sense, Dr. Winters said to her assistant, holding 2 evidence bags up to the light. The chain of custody shows the samples going to the lab on November 16. But the lab technician's signature is dated November 18. That's a 48-hour gap. Could be a paperwork error, her assistant suggested. Or someone switched the samples. Winters pulled up the original lab technician's file. His name was David Kowalski, and according to his employment record, he'd been disciplined twice. Once in 2006 for mishandling evidence, once in 2008 for accepting a bribe from a defense attorney. Winters picked up her phone. We need to talk to David Kowalski. Now. But David Kowalski was already talking. News of the investigation had reached him through the law enforcement grapevine, and his conscience, dormant for 9 years, suddenly woke up screaming. He walked into the Milwaukee Police Department at 3 p.m., asked for the Attorney General's task force and confessed everything. Pierce brought me the samples, Kowalski said, his voice shaking. Said they were from Wallace's garage, from his workbench. Said they needed to match the accelerant from the scene. I didn't question it. Pierce was a detective. I was just a lab tech. You contaminated the samples, Investigator Santos said. It wasn't a question. I didn't just contaminate them. I switched them. Pierce gave me samples that were already soaked in gasoline, said to make sure they matched the fire patterns. I flagged them as coming from Wallace's clothing. Kowalski's face was gray. I knew it was wrong. I knew it. But Pierce said Wallace was guilty anyway, that we were just making sure the evidence was clear. And he paid me $2,000 cash. The case was unraveling like a sweater with one pulled thread, each tug revealing more corruption, more conspiracy, more lies stacked on lies until the whole structure came crashing down. By October 31st, 72 hours after the Chapel miracle, the task force had enough evidence to arrest Pierce. Multiple counts of evidence tampering, perjury, conspiracy to commit murder, insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice. The arrest warrant went out at 4 p.m. At 4:17 p.m., Harlan Pierce's office, a small consulting business he ran in his retirement, erupted in flames. The explosion was heard 3 blocks away. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, windows blown out, the interior a raging inferno. They found Pierce's body in what used to be his private office, burned beyond recognition. The medical examiner would need dental records for positive identification. Investigators combed through the wreckage. The fire had been intense, concentrated, destructive, exactly the kind of fire Pierce had orchestrated a dozen times before. Accelerant patterns suggested gasoline, poured liberally throughout the office. Pierce's car was still in the parking lot. His phone was found in the debris, melted but intact enough to recover data. Suicide or murder? Agent Chin stood in the ruins watching the evidence team work. Could be either, Santos replied. Man knows his whole life is about to end in a courtroom. Maybe he decided to end it on his own terms. Or someone decided to end it for him. Tie up loose ends. Marcus Brennan? Brennan's got the resources. Got the motive. If Pierce was about to flip, to testify against him. Chin shrugged. Dead men don't talk. But the evidence was inconclusive. The fire had destroyed too much. Pierce's death would be ruled suspicious but undetermined, a mystery that would haunt the case for years to come. Meanwhile, the surviving officers from the chapel were summoned to give testimony. Under oath. On the record, Officer Ryan Holt went first. 24 years old, barely a year on the job, his career on the line with every word he spoke. "Tell us what you witnessed in the chapel," the Attorney General's deputy asked. Holt took a breath. "I witnessed a miracle." The room went silent. "I witnessed Officer Daniel Briggs confess to perjury under what I can only describe as divine compulsion. I witnessed light that shouldn't exist. I witnessed peace that defied explanation. And I witnessed the truth breaking free after 9 years of imprisonment." "Are you saying you believe in miracles, Officer Holt?" "I'm saying I saw one, sir." Officer Marcus Webb testified next, then Officer Patterson. Each man told the same story: the impossible light, the confession, the presence of something vast and gentle and undeniably real. Each man risked his career by speaking truth that sounded like insanity. Father Gabriel's testimony was the most compelling. 70 years of priesthood, 32 years ministering to condemned men, his credibility beyond question. "I have seen many men pray in that chapel," Father Gabriel said. "I have seen genuine repentance and desperate bargaining and hollow last-minute conversions. But what I witnessed with Philip Wallace was different. That was intervention. That was grace made manifest. That was God saying enough." By November 3rd, the evidence was overwhelming. The Attorney General prepared to file a motion for Philip Wallace's immediate release and exoneration. And then Judge Raymond Haskell, assigned to review the motion, issued an unexpected ruling. The stay of execution was lifted. Philip Wallace's death sentence was reinstated. Execution scheduled for November 15, 2014, at 12:01 a.m. The Attorney General's office erupted in chaos. "This is insane," Investigator Chin shouted into her phone. "We have Briggs's confession. We have Pierce's financial records. We have the 911 call. How can Haskell ignore all of it?" "Someone got to him," Santos said quietly. "Follow the money." They did. And what they found made the blood drain from Chen's face. 3 days before Haskell's ruling, a wire transfer had been made to an offshore account in his name. Amount: $500,000. Source: a shell company owned by Marcus Brennan. Judge Raymond Haskell had been bought. And Philip Wallace, innocent man and witness to a miracle, was once again sentenced to die. Philip Wallace sat in his cell and counted the days. 12, 11, 10. The numbers ticked down like a countdown to oblivion, each one heavier than the last. He'd been so close. For 3 glorious days, he'd allowed himself to believe that the miracle in the chapel meant something. That truth would prevail. That justice would finally, after 9 years, catch up to lies. But Judge Haskell's ruling had shattered that hope like glass under a hammer. How can they do this? Philip's mother sobbed through the phone during her emergency visit. After everything that's come out. After Briggs's confession. After. "It's okay, Mom," Philip said, though it wasn't. Nothing was okay. "It's not okay. That judge was bribed. Everyone knows it. The Attorney General is fighting it, Philip. They're appealing. They won't let this stand." But appeals took time. And Philip had 12 days. 11, 10. Father Gabriel visited daily now, sometimes twice a day. The old priest had aged visibly in the past week, the weight of what he'd witnessed pressing down on his shoulders like physical burden. "I don't understand," Father Gabriel said on day 9. "Why would God show us a miracle only to let you die anyway?" Philip looked at the prayer card he still kept, the Virgin Mary's face faded but still serene. Maybe the miracle wasn't about saving me. Maybe it was about revealing the truth. About freeing Briggs from his guilt. About showing everyone that heaven is real and watching. That's very philosophical for a man about to die. I've had a lot of time to think. But the truth was, Philip was terrified. The peace he'd felt in the chapel was fading, replaced by the old familiar dread. He prayed the rosary until his fingers were numb, whispered the same prayers his mother had taught him, begged the Virgin Mary to intercede one more time. The dreams had stopped. For 8 nights, Philip slept in ordinary darkness, unvisited by Grace or the woman in blue. Their absence felt like abandonment. On day 7, Father Gabriel arrived at Philip's cell with an expression Philip had never seen before, something between hope and disbelief. "Have you seen the news?" the priest asked. "They don't let us watch TV on death row, Father." "The video." Officer Holt's video from the chapel. "It leaked." Philip sat up. What? Someone we don't know who uploaded it to the internet. It's everywhere, Philip. Everywhere. Millions of views. News networks are running it. People are calling it proof of divine intervention. Father Gabriel pulled out his phone, breaking protocol, and showed Philip the screen. The video was grainy, shot on a phone in low light, but the audio was crystal clear. Briggs's voice cracking with emotion. I lied about the confession. He never said it. Wallace never said I did it. And the light. That impossible column of white brilliance where the Virgin Mary statue should have been, overexposing the camera's sensor, turning the corner of the chapel into pure radiance. It's all anyone's talking about, Father Gabriel continued, scrolling through news headlines. Scientists are trying to explain the light. Theologians are debating whether it's authentic. But the confession, Philip, Briggs's confession is undeniable. Even the people who don't believe in miracles can't ignore that. Philip watched his own image on the small screen, kneeling in that golden glow, his face turned upward, tears streaming. He looked like a different person. He looked like someone who believed. Has it changed anything? Philip asked quietly. Father Gabriel's expression faltered. The governor's office is being flooded with calls. The attorney general is filing emergency motions. But Judge Haskell is refusing to reverse his ruling. He's claiming the video is inadmissible, possibly doctored, and that Briggs's confession was made under duress. Duress? Philip almost laughed. He was under duress from God. That's essentially what our lawyers are arguing. It's not going well. By day 5, protests had erupted outside Waupun Correctional Institution. Hundreds of people at first, then thousands holding signs and candles and rosaries. Some came from Milwaukee, from Philip's old neighborhood, people who remembered him as the firefighter who'd run into burning buildings to save strangers. Others came from across the country, drawn by the viral video, convinced they were witnessing something sacred. Free Philip Wallace, the signs read. Truth will shine. Divine intervention is real. News helicopters circled overhead. Camera crews set up on every corner with a view of the prison. Reporters interviewed everyone, the protesters, the investigators, forensic experts, theologians, skeptics. Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a physicist from MIT, appeared on national television with his analysis of the video. The light phenomenon is consistent with an extremely intense electromagnetic pulse. It's possible there was some kind of electrical surge in the chapel that affected the camera's sensor. But the prison's electrical grid didn't show any surge, the interviewer countered. That's unusual, Dr. Reynolds admitted. I can't fully explain it. But I'm not prepared to call it supernatural. Father Thomas Aquinas O'Brien, a Jesuit priest and theologian from Georgetown, offered a different perspective. What we're seeing in this video is consistent with historical accounts of Marian apparitions. The light, the transformation of those present, the compulsion to confession. These are hallmarks of genuine mystical experience. So you believe this was real? That the Virgin Mary appeared in a prison chapel? I believe something extraordinary happened. Something that transcends our usual categories of explanation. Whether we call it miracle or mystery or divine intervention, the effect is undeniable. Truth was revealed. An innocent man was vindicated. That alone is worth celebrating. Inside his cell, Philip watched the news coverage on Father Gabriel's phone, feeling strangely detached from his own story. He was becoming a symbol, saint or fraud depending on who was talking. But he was still a man counting down to his own death. 4 days. 3 days. 2. On the night before his execution, Philip knelt beside his bed and prayed with an intensity that burned. He clutched the prayer card so tightly it crumpled in his hands. Please, he whispered. Please don't let me die for something I didn't do. I know you're real. I saw you. I felt you. Please. He prayed until exhaustion took him, pulled him down into sleep. And finally, after 8 nights of silence, Grace returned. She stood in the field of white flowers, but this time she wasn't alone. Emma was beside her, one hand resting on their daughter's shoulder. Both of them were smiling, radiant, more real than any dream had a right to be. Daddy, Grace said, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the impossible blue sky. Grace, baby, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't save you. You did save us, Emma said softly. You're saving us right now. By telling the truth. By standing in the light. But I'm going to die. Tomorrow. They're going to kill me and I'll never. The fire that took us, Grace interrupted, her voice carrying a weight beyond her 6 years, will light your way home. Philip woke with a gasp. The cell was dark, cold, exactly as it always was. But the prayer card in his hand was warm again, impossibly warm, and the scent of lilies filled the small space. November 15, 2014. Execution Day. Philip showered, dressed in the clothes they gave him, ate nothing of the breakfast they offered. Father Gabriel arrived at 9 a.m. and stayed, praying with him, sitting in silence, simply being present. "I'm afraid," Philip admitted at 10 a.m. "So am I," Father Gabriel replied. Outside, the protest had swelled to over 5,000 people. They held vigil, sang hymns, prayed the rosary in unison. Media vans lined every street. The Attorney General's office filed one last emergency appeal. The governor's phone rang constantly. But Judge Haskell didn't budge. Neither did the state Supreme Court. The execution would proceed as scheduled. At 11 p.m., the 4 officers came to Philip's cell. Not the same 4 from the chapel. Briggs was under investigation, Webb had requested different duty, and Patterson had taken leave. But the new officers had all seen the video. All knew what they were escorting. "I'm sorry," Officer David Chin said quietly as he fastened the restraints. "For what it's worth, I don't think you did it." "Thank you," Philip replied. They walked the familiar route. Cell Block H to the medical wing. Past the chapel where it had all happened. Down the final corridor to the execution chamber. The room was clinical, sterile, designed to make death look medical rather than punitive. A gurney with restraints. 4 lines already prepared. Witnesses behind glass. Victims' families, media representatives, the warden, the chaplain. But no attorney general. No governor. No last-minute stay. Philip was strapped to the gurney at 11:47 p.m. The medical technician checked the 4 lines, adjusted the flow rates, prepared the 3-drug protocol that would stop his heart. Father Gabriel stood nearby, rosary beads wrapped around his weathered hands, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Any last words?" Warden Callahan asked, his voice heavy with regret. Philip looked at the ceiling, then at Father Gabriel, then at the glass partition behind which people waited to watch him die. "I forgive everyone who put me here," he said clearly. "And I trust that truth is stronger than lies. Always." The warden nodded. "Proceed." The medical technician reached for the first syringe, the sedative that would render Philip unconscious before the paralytic and potassium chloride stopped his breathing and his heart. 11:58 p.m. The needle pierced the foreport. 11:59 p.m. The technician's finger hovered over the plunger. 12 a.m. midnight. November 16th. The official moment of execution. And then the lights went out. Not just in the execution chamber. Not just in the medical wing. Every light in Waupun Correctional Institution went dark simultaneously, all 847 fixtures, all at once, as if someone had thrown a switch on reality itself. Emergency generators should have kicked in immediately. They didn't. Darkness. Complete and total. For 3 seconds, nothing. No sound. No light. Just blackness and the sound of held breath. And then, seeping under the execution chamber door like liquid gold, came the light. The same impossible golden radiance from the chapel. The same warmth. The same presence. It filled the room slowly, deliberately, like dawn breaking in reverse. It wrapped around the gurney, around Philip's restrained form, around Father Gabriel who dropped to his knees with a sound that was half sob, half prayer. The witnesses behind the glass partition cried out. Some pressed forward to see. Others backed away in terror. The medical technician's hand froze on the syringe, unable to move, unable to complete the execution. And Philip Wallace, strapped to a gurney designed for death, opened his eyes and saw her standing beside him. The Virgin Mary. Not the statue. The woman herself. Radiant. Real. Her hand outstretched toward his face, her expression infinite compassion. "Not yet," she said, and her voice was every mother's voice, every promise of protection, every assurance that love is stronger than death. "Not yet, beloved. You have more to witness." The light blazed brighter, and somewhere in the prison, every phone simultaneously received the same message. An email from an untraceable source with a single attachment. The complete financial records of Marcus Brennan's criminal enterprise. Names, dates, payments, murders. Everything. The fire that had taken Emma and Grace was about to light Philip's way home. Just as Grace had promised. The golden light filled the execution chamber like water filling a vessel, rising from the floor, wrapping around every person, every surface, every molecule of air. It was warm without heat, bright without harshness, and it carried with it that same unmistakable scent of lilies that had filled the chapel 2 weeks ago. The medical technician, A 30-year veteran named Robert Mills who'd assisted in 42 executions, dropped the syringe. His hands flew to his chest, not in pain but in overwhelming emotion, as if his heart was expanding beyond what his ribcage could contain. "Oh my God," he breathed. "Oh my God, oh my God." Behind the glass partition, Emma's sister Jennifer collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed against the window. She'd come to watch the man who killed her sister die. But the woman standing beside Philip's gurney, radiant, impossible, undeniably present, was looking at Jennifer with such compassion that 9 years of hatred cracked open like an egg. "I'm sorry," Jennifer sobbed. "I'm sorry, Philip. I'm so sorry." Warden Callahan, who'd presided over 17 executions in his 23-year career, fell to his knees. Not from weakness. From recognition. From the absolute certainty that he was in the presence of something. Someone infinitely greater than himself. "Stop the execution," he said, his voice shaking. "Stop everything. Now." Father Gabriel remained on his knees, his rosary beads clutched so tightly they cut into his palms. He was praying in Latin now, the old prayers of his seminary days, words he'd thought forgotten returning like old friends. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum. The Virgin Mary, and there was no longer any doubt that's who she was, stood beside Philip's gurney with one hand resting gently on his forehead. Her other hand gestured toward the door, toward something beyond the execution chamber. "Look," she said, and her voice was command and invitation at once. The door opened, though no one had touched it. Officer David Chin stood in the doorway, his face illuminated by the glow from within, his phone clutched in his trembling hand. "The files," he gasped. "Everyone just received files. Financial records. Evidence. Everything about Brennan's operation. It came from nowhere. Every phone in the prison got it simultaneously." "That's impossible," Warden Callahan said, though even as he spoke, he knew that word had lost all meaning tonight. "The email has attachments. Ledgers. Bank statements. Communications between Brennan and Pierce. And something else, a journal. Handwritten pages. It's from?" Chin looked at his phone screen, his face pale. "It's from Thomas Wayne Kohler, the arsonist who died in a fire 3 years ago. His journal." The Virgin Mary smiled, a sad, gentle smile that held both vindication and sorrow for all the suffering that had led to this moment. Then, as the witnesses watched, she began to fade. Not disappearing but becoming translucent, like morning mist burning away in sunlight. Her hand lifted from Philip's forehead. "The truth will shine where lies cannot," she said, echoing the words written on the prayer card 9 years ago. "Remember this gift. Use it wisely." And then she was gone. The golden light remained a moment longer, then faded gradually, like the sun setting over a calm sea. The emergency generators finally kicked in, flooding the execution chamber with harsh fluorescent brightness that seemed almost obscene after what they'd witnessed. Philip Wallace lay on the gurney, still restrained, tears streaming down his temples into his hair. He was laughing and crying at once, his body shaking with relief so profound it bordered on hysteria. "She came back," he said. "She came back." Father Gabriel crawled to the gurney, his old joints protesting, and gripped Philip's hand through the restraints. "Yes, my son. Yes, she did." Warden Callahan stood slowly, his legs unsteady. He looked at the medical technician, at the unused syringe on the floor, at the witnesses still kneeling behind the glass. "Remove the restraints," he said. "This execution is terminated." The journal of Thomas Wayne Kohler became the final nail in a coffin already well sealed. Kohler had been a freelance arsonist, a torch for hire, who died in what authorities ruled an accidental fire in his garage workshop 3 years ago. But the fire hadn't destroyed everything. A metal lockbox, hidden in the crawlspace and missed by investigators, contained his insurance policy, a detailed record of every job he'd ever done. The journal was 147 pages of meticulous notes. Dates, addresses, fees paid, and who'd hired him. Page 89 listed the Wallace house. November 14, 2005. Hired by H.P. Detective Harlan Pierce. Fee, $25,000. Special instructions, make it look like the husband. He's a firefighter, use his tools. Kohler had written about cutting the gas line, pouring accelerant from Philip's own garage can, breaking in through the back window. He'd written about the woman who'd seen him, who'd tried to run upstairs to her daughter. He'd written, in cold, clinical language, about how he'd knocked Philip unconscious on the lawn and arranged the scene to look like Philip had escaped his own fire. And then he'd collected his money and moved on to the next job. The journal landed on Attorney General Sarah Thompson's desk at 1:47 a.m., forwarded from the mysterious email that had reached every phone in Waupun. She read it twice, then called the governor. "We have everything," she said. "Brennan pierced the whole conspiracy. And we have proof that Philip Wallace is innocent." By dawn on November 16, Marcus Brennan was in federal custody. His assets were frozen. His empire was crumbling. And Philip Wallace was a free man. The exoneration came swiftly, a legal process that usually took months compressed into 72 hours because the evidence was so overwhelming and the injustice so profound. Judge Haskell, facing bribery charges, recused himself. A new judge reviewed the case and vacated Philip's conviction with a statement that would be quoted in law journals for years to come. "It is the finding of this court that Philip Michael Wallace is innocent. Not merely not guilty, but innocent. He has been the victim of a conspiracy so vast and a corruption so deep that it shakes this court's faith in the very systems meant to protect justice. Mr. Wallace, on behalf of the state of Wisconsin, I offer our most profound apologies. No words can restore what was taken from you. But we can at least restore your freedom." Philip walked out of Waupun Correctional Institution on November 19, 2014, 9 years and 12 days after entering. His mother waited outside the gates, supported by Father Gabriel on one side and Captain Jerry Holcomb on the other. The crowd of protesters had become a celebration, thousands of people cheering, crying, holding signs that read, "Welcome home, Philip," and "Miracles are real." Philip stopped at the gates, overwhelmed. The sky was impossibly blue. The air tasted like freedom. He dropped to his knees on the pavement and wept. Months passed. The trials proceeded, Brennan, his associates, the corrupt officials who'd enabled the conspiracy. David Kowalski, the lab technician who'd switched evidence, testified in exchange for a reduced sentence. Officer Daniel Briggs, granted immunity for his testimony, spoke truth in courtroom after courtroom, his face haunted but his voice steady. Judge Haskell was disbarred and sentenced to 15 years. Marcus Brennan received life without parole. The investigation uncovered 17 separate arsons for deaths, and a web of corruption that reached into police departments, fire marshal offices, and insurance companies across Wisconsin. But Philip Wallace wasn't there to see most of it. He had somewhere more important to be. On a cold December morning, Philip drove to Holy Cross Cemetery in Milwaukee. Father Gabriel accompanied him, silent and respectful, keeping a few steps back as Philip approached two graves side by side. Emma Wallace, beloved wife and mother. Grace Wallace, precious daughter and light of our lives. Philip knelt in the snow between them. He'd brought flowers, white lilies, and the prayer card, the one that had started everything, now protected in a plastic sleeve. "I kept my promise," Philip said quietly. "I found the truth, and the truth set me free. Just like she said it would." He placed the prayer card carefully against Emma's headstone, weighing it down with a small stone so the wind wouldn't take it. "Grace came to me in dreams," Philip continued, his voice breaking. "She said you were together, that you were waiting, that you understood." He wiped his eyes. "I hope that's true. I hope you know I never stopped loving you. Either of you. Not for 1 second of 9 years." Father Gabriel stepped forward, placed a hand on Philip's shoulder. They stood together in the snow, two men who'd witnessed the impossible, paying respects to the innocent dead. "What will you do now?" the priest asked. Philip looked at the graves, at the prayer card resting against the stone, at the sky that seemed bluer than it should be in December. "I'm going to help people," he said. "Other people like me. Innocent people in cages. I'm going to shine light into dark places." 6 months later, the Grace Light Foundation opened its doors in a small office in downtown Milwaukee. Philip, with the help of legal advocates and forensic experts, began reviewing cases of potentially wrongful convictions. The foundation's logo was simple, a candle flame inside a child's handprint. The officers who'd witnessed the miracles became some of the foundation's strongest supporters. Officer Ryan Holt left corrections work and joined the foundation full-time as an investigator. Officer Marcus Webb started a program training police departments in proper evidence handling. Officer Patterson, the hardened veteran who'd thought he'd seen everything, began attending daily mass at St. Augustine's. Even Daniel Briggs found a path forward. Broken and remorseful, he volunteered at the foundation, reaching out to officers who might have information about other questionable cases. He would never forgive himself. But he could at least help others avoid his mistakes. Father Gabriel watched it all unfold with quiet joy. The miracle hadn't just saved Philip Wallace. It had transformed everyone it touched, rippling outward like light through water, changing lives in ways both large and small. 3 years passed, then 5. The Grace Light Foundation helped exonerate 14 wrongfully convicted people. Philip's story became a book, then a documentary. The chapel video remained unexplained. Scientists proposed theories, skeptics claimed fraud, believers pointed to the transformed lives as proof that something real had happened. But the Virgin Mary statue in the Waupun Chapel stood silent, just marble and paint, looking exactly as it always had. Until it didn't. On a Tuesday night in March 2019, Warden James Callahan, still at his post, still carrying the weight of what he'd witnessed, was working late in his office when the night shift supervisor knocked on his door. "Sir, you need to see this." Callahan followed him to the chapel. The door was open, golden light spilling into the corridor. Inside, an inmate was kneeling before the Virgin Mary statue. The man was sobbing, his hands cuffed but raised in supplication. And around him, around the statue, around the entire chapel, was that same impossible golden glow. The man's name was Marcus Chin. Convicted of murdering his business partner. Sentenced to death. Maintained his innocence for 7 years. And now, in the presence of that light, a guard was beginning to speak, confessing to evidence he'd suppressed, testimony he'd changed, truth he'd buried. Callahan stood in the doorway, his heart hammering. He pulled out his phone, found Philip Wallace's number and called. "Philip, it's happening again. The light. The confession. Everything." On the other end, Philip's voice was calm. "I'll be there in an hour. Don't let them stop it. Whatever happens, let the truth come out." The next morning, Warden Callahan found an envelope slipped under his office door. No return address. No postage. Inside was a single photograph, the chapel, the kneeling inmate, the impossible light. And at the bottom of the photo, written in blue ink in elegant script, 2 words. "She's back." Callahan looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he pinned it to his bulletin board, right next to the mission statement of the Grace Light Foundation. Because the work wasn't finished. Justice wasn't complete. There were still innocent people in cages, still lies that needed exposing, still truth waiting to shine where darkness had reigned too long. And somewhere, in the space between heaven and earth, between miracle and mercy, the Virgin Mary was still watching. Still waiting. Still ready to intercede when the innocent cried out for vindication. The light hadn't gone out. It had only been waiting for the next person who needed it. And it would return, again and again, for as long as there were people willing to kneel in faith and whisper the same prayer Philip Wallace had whispered 9 years ago. "If I die innocent, let them see it." Truth, after all, is stronger than lies. Always, thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next. Click on the image or video showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.